Abby's shrill cries echoed through the hall, shredding through the thin veil of sleep I'd settled into barely an hour before. Alan rolled in place, groaning wordlessly as he folded the pillow over his ears. I stared daggers into him, scoffing to myself before wiping the sleep from my eyes and pulling myself from bed. It had been his job to put her down for bed last time, so I supposed it was mine to check on her. I shot a glance at the clock on my husband's bedside table, though I already knew what the time would read. 2 a.m. more or less on the dot. The clock read 2:03, right on schedule. Despite having dealt with the process every night for the past few weeks, it never got easier. It was as if our daughter had reverted back to her days as a newborn, rapidly regressing since turning 3. Things had been relatively easy with her over the years, but in the last few weeks, she'd become more difficult than usual. There had been complaints about misbehaving at daycare, hitting other kids, and biting, things of that nature, and we'd noticed in our own day-to-day life that she was beginning to grow obstinate. Where she'd once been an agreeable and rather easygoing kid, she was now difficult, often seeming to listen clearly only to turn around and do the opposite of what she was told, or something entirely different and altogether unacceptable. It was like she was trying to goad a reaction out of people. One of the hardest parts to her challenging new behavior was her sudden inability to sleep through the night. It was like she'd found some new, messed up circadian rhythm all of a sudden. We thought it might be the new house, a side effect of having a young child in an unfamiliar environment, but it felt odd. She'd been fine for the first week or so in the new place. Hell, she'd seemed to love it. And then one night, a little over 9 days after we'd settled in, she began the nightly tantrums, setting off every night around 2 a.m. like she was following a schedule. Given the fact that Abigail was still relatively nonverbal and couldn't really articulate herself in any other way, we dismissed the tantrums as anything other than commonplace. I shuddered as my feet met the wood floor, the chill of fall filling the room. I grabbed my robe from the foot of the ottoman beside our bed, throwing it over my shoulders as I made my way to Abby's room. The hallway was pitch black, only faint traces of moonlight could be seen shining through the solitary window. Even through the grogginess and irritation, a blooming unease found a home, growing with each protesting groan of the floorboards, and my daughter's shrill cry echoing off the walls. As my hand closed over the cool brass of the doorknob, my ears perked up unintentionally. As my body tried to account for the lack of sight, I heard something that made me freeze in place. Amidst the sound of Abigail's crying, I felt certain I'd heard a voice. For the briefest of moments, I thought it was her father's before immediately remembering I'd left him behind in the bedroom. My stomach dropped, a surge of sudden panic dissipating the final mist of sleep clinging to me. I threw open the door, heart pounding as I rushed forward and into the room. Quickly, I made my way to the side of Abigail's crib, nearly tripping in the act as my foot fell upon something soft and plush. I looked down to see the large stuffed bear I'd assumed my husband had gotten her when we moved. She'd been clinging to it like a flotation device in water every time I'd seen her since. Upon assuring her safety, I set to scouring the room for any sign of intrusion. My eyes frantically darted about the little space, and for a moment my own reflection on the sliding mirrored doors of the closet made my heart jump. I quickly pulled open the closest, it being the only place in the room someone could hide themselves. To find it entirely empty, I meticulously scanned the room as far as I could tell undisturbed from the night before. The moonlight cast shadows across the carpet, making strange and forbidding figures of the mundane. It occurred to me that she must have tossed it out of her crib sometime during the night, and I wondered if that wasn't the reason for the latest of her nightly outbursts. As I picked up the stuffed animal sitting on the floor beside her bed, I found myself peering in through the thin wooden bars at my daughter. I felt a surge of relief as I saw her, though it was quickly replaced by a familiar sort of exhaustion. As she cried, her little face scrunched and reddening, that I would be spending the next few hours of precious sleep time trying to get her back to sleep. I reached into the crib, gently lifting her from the bed and pulling her into my chest. Almost immediately, her cries settled into a soft babble, and I felt a flood of emotion I'd only known post-pregnancy, an overwhelming sort of love. I made my way to the rocking chair opposite the bed, settling into a rhythm as I began to hum a lullaby. At the back of my mind, I replayed those moments before I'd entered, questioning whether I'd really heard anything at all. I had felt so sure in those brief moments before I'd entered that there had been another voice, yet the window was shut and the room empty with the exception of my little girl. She was calm now, or no longer crying, at least, but her eyes were wet and her nose was red, still running from her prior tantrum. She babbled softly, her head bobbing as she leaned back to look at me, her mouth trying to work around some word. "Daddy," I chuckled, despite the exhaustion rapidly regaining its footing. "No, not Daddy. He's sleeping. It's Mommy." She looked at me as though somehow her little mind was unsatisfied with the response before turning and pointing one of her little fingers towards the crib. "Daddy." It took me a moment to understand what she was asking as I stood and made my way to the crib, reaching in for the stuffed bear her father must have gotten her at some point. I felt her grip tighten around me as she spun away, hiding her face in my neck. Something in me twisted at that, a distant unease in my gut, instinctual though vague. I looked the ratty thing over with mild interest. For the life of me, I couldn't understand why Alan had chosen it for her of all things. It was a large, rather ratty thing, clearly a hand-me-down if the line of stitching running along its belly told me anything. He'd likely seen it on one of our shopping trips at the local thrift shop as we tried to furnish our home on a budget and thought of our Abigail. It was sweet, though a part of me wondered if he'd remembered to wash it. I made a mental note to ask him in the morning. It clearly meant a lot to Abby, and from the moment I'd noticed it, it had been practically glued to her hand, never to be anywhere she wasn't, which is why I found her reaction somewhat unnerving. I lowered the stuffed toy back into the crib, somewhat surprised by the weight of the thing as I did so, a bit heavier than I might have expected. Abigail glanced over her shoulder curiously, as if to ensure I'd moved the toy, turning around fully when she saw it back in the bed. I felt something stir in me that I couldn't quite place, again, something odd in her reaction that triggered some instinctual sort of maternal unease in me. My eye lingered on the doll, before searching the room once more for comfort, and settling into the rocking chair with my daughter. It took several minutes for that faint unease to fade to the back of my mind, lingering silently under the surface, and it took a little longer than that for Abby's breathing to slow and sleep to fall over her again. I could feel the drowsiness billowing back up in me as well, my eyes feeling grainy, lids heavy, as the faint creak of the chair formed a dissonant lullaby. The protesting groan of the floorboards and the screech of the door's hinges pierced the veil of sleep that had come to settle over me. Suddenly, I found myself going straight into defense mode, my mind immediately thinking back to the voice I'd thought I had heard earlier, and my eyes shot open. It took a moment to adjust to the darkness, and my heart plummeted into an icy pool of fear in my gut as the outline of a man grew apparent in the doorway, only settling once my husband spoke. "You coming back to bed, Leanne?" he asked, sleep audible in his voice as he rubbed at his eyes. I took a breath, allowing my heartbeat to return to a normal pace, before nodding. "Yeah, just had to get her back down," I said, doing my best to rise from the seat as carefully as possible to avoid waking Abigail. I made my way to the crib, slowly lowering her in besides the stuffed bear, before making my way towards Alan. "You okay?" he muttered, closing the door as silently as he could manage as we crept back towards our room. Some of that lingering unease must have been visible on my face, I realized. I shrugged, shaking my head as though to free my mind of the cobwebs of exhaustion. Yeah, I'm fine. I shrugged, hearing that voice again in my mind, the sound so clear I had to wonder if I wasn't misremembering. Thought I'd heard a voice earlier, in Abby's room. Seeing the flood of emotions making their way to his face, I quickly added, "I checked everywhere. The room's empty. I think I'm just tired." He nodded but glanced back at the room for a moment, as if considering whether or not to check himself. I placed a hand on his arm, stifling a yawn. "It's okay, Alan, she's fine." He nodded, casting a parting look at Abigail's door, before turning and heading with me back to our bedroom. I glanced once more down the hall, its darkness casting it in an unshakable eeriness, and did my best to assure myself Abby was alright despite the odd, vague feelings of unease still clinging so stubbornly. Sleep came soon after we climbed back under the covers, and while I struggled to recollect my dreams from that night, I know they were dark, the sort to ensure my sleep was a restless one. Looking back, I wonder if it was my mind's way of warning me not to let my guard down that the worst was yet to pass. Cheerios or Frosted Flakes? I asked, lifting both of the boxes, raising an eyebrow as I asked Abigail for the third time which of our two kinds of cereal she wanted. I'd already had to clean up a bowl of oatmeal from the kitchen floor that she'd tossed in a little fit of rage. The question only prompted more tears, her face growing a bright red and wrinkling into a silent scream, as though she were building up for another bout of shrieking. That morning had been especially challenging. Abigail was acting out even more than she had been in the past few weeks, to the point that Alan was offering his apologies on the way out the door, knowing that I'd have to wrangle her all alone, while also trying to manage my online classes. By the time afternoon rolled around, I was at my wit's end. My nerves were so far beyond frayed that every noise seemed poised to send me into a fit of irritation. Class had started, and despite moderate success for a few hours, Abby had set back into one of her tantrums again, this time showing no signs of stopping. There was a test that day, and after spending most of the time juggling between my class and Abby, I did something I knew better than and hated doing. I flicked on the television, turning to the first YouTube playlist I saw featuring familiar kids' characters. Mommy just needs just 20 minutes, baby. Please just watch TV. Okay, I'll be right back. I left her in front of the living room television, hurrying to shut myself off in the room before too much time could pass on my exam. I did my best to stifle the flood of emotions I felt as I heard her cries grow louder, tottering behind me. As I entered the small room off of the living room, which I'd been using as an office, I closed the door behind me. Abby's cries rose into shrieks, her little fists pounding against the door. I swallowed hard, sighing as I fought back the watering in my eyes. Just 20 minutes. She'll be okay for 20 minutes. I tried to remind myself, every bit of me wanting to open the door despite my exhaustion. I remained steadfast, making my way to the computer and beginning work. After a few minutes she stopped, her cries falling into pitiful sniffles before I could hear her totter away. I tried not to rush through my test, my grade in the class already having suffered from so many sleepless nights, yet my mind wavered between the work and thoughts of Abby. I pushed through, eventually losing myself in the test as it grew in difficulty until I'd reached the end, falling back in my chair. With a sigh, I turned in place, spinning the seat to face the window that made up most of the wall. Outside, I could see the neighbor lady, Mrs. Janice Melody, as she told me to call her, and her husband in their yard. Their ancient old pickup shone in the driveway, a unique shade of orange that could be described as something of an eyesore at best. She was watering the grass, despite the fact that the Illinois weather almost certainly meant some more snow could be expected before summer. While he passed out popsicles to a few of the local kids, a group of boys taking a break from their play. They'd been playing a game of street hockey, which I tried to drown out while working, but watched with some mild interest. As my mind drifted to thoughts of the future, it wouldn't be too long before Abigail was out there. I could almost see her in my mind, a perfect mix of her father and I, smart and sweet, but with an attitude to boot, out there with the other kids. After a moment, Mr. Melody, I'd yet to remember his name, appeared to return to his house, disappearing to the side of my window and out of view. I watched for a few more minutes as the kids continued their game, his wife stopping her busy work every few minutes to yell at them when the ball touched her lawn, or some similar offense, remaining lost in thoughts of the future. It was as one of the children fell, scraping a knee and crying out, attracting the attention of one of the parents, that I realized, with a feeling of dawning horror that any parent knows, it had been too long since I'd last heard Abby. The few times I've had to lock myself away to get work done, she settled in the living room outside the office, distracting herself scrolling through YouTube and playing with the assortment of toys we'd gotten her over the years. The sounds of her little babbles or clattering of toys was something I'd listen for at points to make sure she was alright. I had gotten distracted, first by the test, and then my own thoughts in the first real moment of silence I'd had all day. I had let the time get away from me, forgetting completely to keep an ear out. I shot up from my seat, hurrying to the door, yet feeling unable to move fast enough for my heart as it pounded in my throat, feeling every bit a shoddy parent. Abby, I called, swinging the door open to the sight of an empty living room. My breath caught in my throat, The only sound to greet me was the antics of whatever cartoon characters came over the television. I hurried to the kitchen next, calling her name as I checked behind the island in the off chance that she was playing some random game of hide and seek. Yet as I went from room to room downstairs, without a sign of her, I felt my heart grow painful in its thunderous beating. A faint nausea nipped at me like a dog at the heels as a faint tremor began to emerge through my body. Abigail, my voice came more forceful than I'd intended, shaking more than I'd have thought as my face grew hot. I searched the first floor, every room coming up empty, the tremor growing, until I shook like a leaf in the wind. As I approached the garage door, I was greeted immediately with a gust of frigid air and the sounds of birds chirping. My heart dropped, disappearing into a pit widening in my gut as I saw that it was somehow ajar. My body seized with awful anxiety. As I opened it fully, the garage was wide open, giving a full view of our neighborhood beyond. My knees shook with the threat of giving way entirely as a sensation like being doused with freezing water almost turned my body to ice. Had it not been for the adrenaline that coursed through me in that instant, searing my veins, as it did so, I might have passed out from the sheer horror of it. It didn't make sense. I was sure I'd heard my husband close it this morning. Had she opened it herself? There was no way. I felt certain. The button was several feet above her head. Besides, surely I'd have heard it. I could see no way for her to have somehow opened it without my notice, and yet the reality remained the same. I cursed myself for getting distracted. Abigail, I shrieked her name, uncaring who I disturbed as I ran out and onto the driveway. I searched, eyes darting about with no idea of where I ought to be looking, the world descending into a blur of colors, sound, and panic around me. A taste of salt was my only warning that terrors were falling. My face, every part of me, feeling numb, like television static had seeped beneath my skin. I could see curtains parting as curious and judging eyes cast glances through windows, wondering about the crazy woman disturbing the peace, but none seemingly willing to venture forth and see what was wrong. I felt lost, unsure of which direction I ought to be going, or where to run, suddenly aware of just how small I was in the vastness of the world. The small groves that lined either side of the street, beyond the yards forming a barrier between the outside world, usually so serene and beautiful, now seemed like treacherous forests, past which I could picture my daughter falling into some ditch crying out for me, or if she'd somehow made it through the brush, out onto the busy streets on either side. I felt as though I could vomit at the thought. I rounded the left side of my house, entering the space between my yard and Miss Melody's. Panic racked my thoughts for every step I took, carrying with it the fear that I was moving farther from where she might be. All the while another part of my mind wondered if she wasn't still in the house somehow, having escaped my thorough search, and by leaving I was putting her in danger. She's gone. She has to be gone. You're an awful mother. She's... The thoughts played on repeat like some record of a nightmare, the very blood rushing through my head audible as my heart pounded. Abigail, I called again, struggling to take in a deep breath as my lungs seemed to quake at the sheer dread, as though the act of taking in oxygen was something requiring concentration I couldn't spare. The sound footfalls in the grass made my head spin as I turned to face whoever was approaching. I could have cried at the sight of Mrs. Melody, despite the sour look the old woman fixed me with, disapproval written within the wrinkles of her face. In her arms, which strained with the effort, she held Abigail, clutching in her hands that ever-present little stuffed bear. Oh my God, thank you. I sucked in a breath, hiccups racking my chest as the tears poured, rushing forth to take hold of my daughter. She pulled back, putting a shoulder between the two of us, her eyes never wavering from mine. It was as though she were trying to see through me, searching for some reason not to return Abby to me. Please, I tried to sound as polite as I could manage, but the edge in my voice was apparent, and I could only imagine how I must have looked in those openly reproachful eyes. I didn't have to see my face to know it was red and splotchy, my hair a mess still from the morning since I'd had no plans of stepping out, screaming like a banshee only moments before. Where was she? I asked, watching Abigail as she chewed on the ear of her teddy with a feeling almost akin to the moment of her birth. An awful anxiety suddenly lifted, though I waited uneasily for her to be returned. My backyard, she spoke, her tone no more pleasant than her expression, making an absolute mess of my garden, I might add. I'm so sorry I took my eyes off of her for a minute, and she was gone. She interrupted, hardly even acknowledging I'd spoken. Just keep your child away from my house. Do you understand me? And keep an eye on the girl. You never know what might happen if she wanders off again. Whoever finds her next time may not nearly be as cordial as myself. Her tone was as cold as ice, and even more biting, no hint of friendliness or subtlety in her words. I couldn't tell if it was a stern warning or a threat. She stepped forward, forcing Abigail into my arms, before appraising the two of us. Then, with a shake of her head, she trudged back down the little hill that sloped into her yard, out of sight. I clutched Abigail close, tears trailing into her hair. The air smelled sweeter, the wind a gentle caress, as my mind lingered on what could have come to pass. Don't do that again. Don't ever leave me again like that, I sobbed. How did you get out? She raised her toy, little arms wavering a bit beneath its weight. Daddy, she cried, before flinging the bear as far as she could manage, sending it tumbling barely a foot away into the grass. I sighed, leaning over to grab it, before making my way back towards the house. My stomach gurgled, the adrenaline fading, leaving only exhaustion, nausea, and anxiety in its wake. I could see the peering eyes through windows as my neighbors watched through slits in curtains, and my face burned hot. As I entered the garage, I cast a parting look in the direction of the Melodies' home, towards the backyard and the grove beyond. As I did so, I caught sight of someone in one of the windows on the second floor, the side nearest my house. I glanced up and caught the eye of Mr. Melody. He was watching me with a look I couldn't read, but one my mind immediately defined as judgment. Casting my eyes away, I made my way inside, heart thudding in my chest. The rest of the day passed by in a blur. No matter what I busied myself with, my mind continuously returning to that afternoon, replaying every way that things could have gone wrong. I didn't let Abigail leave my sight. She spent most of the day in the living room, where I set up the old playpen we hadn't used in months, unwilling to have a repeat of earlier events. I couldn't make sense of it, how she'd ended up outside, knowing there was no plausible way she could have reached that button. That made me deeply uneasy. If she had found a way outside somehow, I couldn't afford to ever let my guard down. Even a bathroom trip could offer her the chance to slip out. The hours seemed to crawl by, me never leaving her side, before Alan had returned from work. He called, stirring me from a sleep I wasn't aware I'd even fallen into as he strolled through the garage door. My eyes darted about the room, searching for Abigail, my heart immediately in my throat, pounding with unrelenting intensity. It wasn't until I realized that she was on the couch beside me, her little form curled against the arm of the chair, fast asleep, that I could breathe again. You okay? Alan asked, slowly lowering his bag as he crossed the room towards me, opening his arms immediately as I fell into them, head shaking without thought. I recounted the events of the afternoon, my test, and the resulting distractions, the panic upon the realization, and the brief confrontation with our neighbor. By the time I was through, tears were running freely. I bit my lip, feeling irritatingly fragile. Get a hold of yourself, I thought, chiding myself silently. I didn't like how off I felt about it all. It was more than just the fact that she had gotten out, as horrifying as that had been, but it felt like there was something more, something greater, that I was failing to see regarding my daughter. And it petrified me. Alan's reaction was a struggle to read, a multitude of feelings seeming to display themselves all at once: concern, shock, and perhaps it was just my conscience, but I thought I could see a bit of blame in his eyes. Still, he hugged me tighter. It's okay, she's okay, we're fine. You just can't let her out of your sight again, I guess. He kneeled in front of Abigail, kissing her lightly on the forehead so as not to wake her. I'll check out that garage door. Maybe it glitched or something, responded to a neighbor's remote. And bang, out she goes. I nodded, though the thought felt unlikely. It brought comfort to have some sort of theory. We should take something over to them, a thank you gift. Maybe it'll smooth things over. We don't want to seem like the dysfunctional family in the neighborhood. I winced at the idea, the very thought of having to see the old woman again making me flush with embarrassment. But I knew he was probably right. She had found Abigail. After all, regardless of what her attitude might have been, surely I owed her for that. I nodded, sighing and running my hands across my face as if to wipe away the events of the day. Alan pulled me close again, pressing his lips against the top of my head. It'll be fine, love, promise. She's okay, everything is okay. Dad, how I wish he had been right. We settled in for dinner half an hour later before setting Abby down for bed. I stood by her crib for what felt like half an hour, caressing her head as she fell back into a deep sleep, arms wrapped around that massive stuffed bear. The old heating system of the house had seemed to kick into overdrive, and Alan had suggested leaving her window open to allow for a little breeze. After some resistance, I relented on the condition that we lock it in place, opening it no more than an inch. The events of that afternoon lingered fresh on my mind, and I wouldn't open the door to allow for a genuine tragedy. I watched her for a few moments as she slept, my heart aching at the thought of what might have happened. After some time, long after the sounds of my husband moving about the house had faded, I made my way to our bedroom and climbed into bed beside him. I pressed in against the heat of his body. Though my back was facing him, my eyes were on the doorway as if somehow it might allow me to peer into her room, though there was little to be seen but the darkness of the hallway. At some point, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and I could fight to keep my eyes open no longer, my thoughts growing loose and sporadic as the fog of sleep grew heavy. I don't know how long I had been out when the commotion of the house snatched me from my slumber. The room was dark when I pulled myself into a sitting position, eyes still bleary and rough with like sandpaper. Yet I had no time to gradually awaken. The sound of my daughter's cry, a shrill shriek like nothing I'd heard from her before, and Alan's voice bellowing my name turned the blood in my veins ice. Alan. My voice was strained and hardly recognizable through the panic that filled it. My heart felt as though it were plummeting through my feet and into the earth, pounding all the while. As I struggled to stand, my head swam, the air thick with a dreamlike quality that, when paired with the stomach-churning anxiety, felt was altogether nightmarish. Alan. I was near the point of tears as I approached her room, the sound of her shrill, pained shrieks making my chest ache sharply. I pushed the door aside with such force it made the wall shake, the sound loud enough to make my ears ring. And yet, as Alan turned to face me, standing beside our daughter's crib holding her close to his chest, his expression bore no surprise, just a blazing panic and sadness. What's wrong? What's going on? In my hurry, I nearly tripped over that godforsaken stuffed bear, the side of my foot where I'd kicked it stinging, as though I'd just kicked a small rock. There was something there, something inside of it more than fur and stuffing, but I had no time to dwell on the matter. As I approached, I could see the reason for all of the commotion, and my stomach dropped through the floor. Her arm. I couldn't finish the sentence, feeling as though the air had been knocked from my lungs. Alan cradled it close to him, not wanting to let the limb dangle, but I could see the state of it even then. It was swollen, the entire arm an angry red color save for an area a bit below her wrist, which stood out a nasty purple. The tremor I felt seemed to rise, until I was shaking uncontrollably, nausea gnawing at my gut as darkness played at the corner of my vision. My head swam as the panic reached a fever pitch. What happened? How did this happen? I don't question stampeded over each other to the forefront of my mind. I felt lightheaded, and my skull pounded with every drumbeat of my heart. The world felt so odd and surreal, as though I were in a nightmare, like I could wake up at any moment still in bed. But no, it was all very real, I could tell. I don't know, he responded, voice strained with emotion, neither of us taking well to seeing our child in pain. I heard a slam, and next thing I know she's screaming. She had to have climbed out of her crib somehow and lost her balance. He looked at me, confusion, and a sort of pain I resonated with on a primal level that seemed to grow with her every cry. She's never done that before. I don't understand. I shook my head. He was right. Abigail had never shown any signs that she'd been trying to climb out of her crib. Had she, it would have been moved to our room that same day. Until now, I wasn't sure she was even capable. It made a small part of me, some minor area still capable of questioning through the sheer panic, wonder why. Why tonight, of all nights, after the somewhat inexplicable events of that afternoon? Still, I had no time for weaving theories at the moment. Alan had risen to his feet and was speeding past me towards the door. Where are you going? I asked, yanked from my thoughts. Hospital. We've got to get this looked at immediately. I nodded, almost feeling stupid that I hadn't thought to suggest it sooner. My head felt all over the place, the events of the day rendering me mentally drained. I just wanted to curl into a little ball, Abigail safely at the center, and sleep for a week. I'll come with you, I started. Just let me throw some pants on. The drive to the hospital was a tense one. I sat in the back with Abby, doing my best not to lose it as I tried and failed to calm her down. Not a second going by that Alan wasn't peering nervously at us in the rearview mirror. The night seemed to move by in a blur of hurried conversation and odd glances. Perhaps it was my exhaustion, but as we sat in the waiting room, while our daughter's arm was scanned, it felt as though every glance spoke of judgment. In my sleep-deprived mind, in some odd way it seemed everyone knew of the events of the day before, my failing, as though the world itself was calling me negligent, and I was beginning to question it myself. What is happening today? I breathed, running my hands across my face and through my hair as I leaned into Alan's shoulder. I could feel him shaking his head as he put his arm over my shoulder. It's been something, he said, voice every bit as tired as I felt. She's getting older. Maybe the terrible twos are showing up a bit late, he offered. I thought for a moment, knowing there could be something to the theory. The sudden temper tantrums and disappearances, and now this incident with the crib. It was all so sudden and unlike her, and my every instinct told me that something was wrong, and yet I couldn't tell what. It felt like that afternoon all over again, an awareness that my daughter could be at great risk, yet an utter directionlessness when attempting to confront it. Mr. and Mrs. Price, the doctor who had presided over Abigail's treatment, called us from across the waiting room, yanking me from my thoughts. Alan was up in an instant, striding across the room in quick pace as I hurried to follow behind, heart pounding in my chest to a nauseating effect. The expression on his face was polite, but slightly somber, and I already expected what we would be told. There was a break just below her wrist in 2 places. Her little arm had been shattered by the contact. The doctor's best guess was in line with our own. She'd likely fallen and broken it in the process, but the mental image sent me back into tears. I know it's upsetting, believe me, but if it's any consolation, little ones are remarkably resilient. She'll likely heal faster than either of you would in a similar circumstance, he said with a sad smile and nod. We'll do our best to make sure her arm is set perfectly. I've got a friend who specializes in pediatric orthoptist. He's one of the best. She'll be safe in his hands. I'll have the front desk give you the number. Thank you, Alan responded, reaching out and shaking the man's hand. The doctor nodded. They'll be bringing Abigail out in a moment. You folks try to get some sleep tonight. She'll need the rest too. The medicine will have dulled the pain, but she'll be tired. I imagine you all are. I simply nodded, still somewhat lost in thought. The doctor affixed me with a tight-lipped smile, the sort that was more apologetic than happy, before turning and beginning back down the hall and onto the rest of his night. He paused as he reached the hallways, and in that instant I could see something like reluctance in his posture as he turned to face me once more. Accidents happen. You shouldn't blame yourselves, he said, though looking at me directly as he did so. I felt my face run flush, realizing my thoughts must have been all but visible on my face, the self-loathing apparent even to a stranger. But also, if you think there might be something wrong, listen to yourself. You know that little girl better than anyone in the world, I'm sure. Sometimes that alarm bell in your head is going off for a reason. Trust your instincts, Mom and Dad. With that, he was gone, leaving me with only a parting smile and enough time to nod my acknowledgement as he disappeared behind a set of double doors and deeper into the hospital. I peered over at Alan, skin prickling with an eerie sort of sensation like some warped deja vu. That was nice of him, he said with a thin smile, exhaustion heavy in his eyes. I'm sure it's standard. We're definitely not the first distraught parents he's dealt with, but cool of him all the same. I nodded again. While logically, I knew his words were likely little more than some standard platitude fed to all the worried parents, I couldn't shake how much it resonated with what I'd been feeling since that morning. It was disconcerting to say the least, and only added to the feeling that I was missing something in plain sight, loose pieces of a puzzle all scattered about my mind with no ability to be connected. I take it you're the parents, a shorter woman with a round face called. The sight of Abigail in her arms scattered any and all previous lines of thinking as both Alan and I hurried to meet her. I scooped her from the woman's arms as gently as I could manage, holding her as one might some restored artifact that would fall to dust in a heavy breeze. Alan handled the rest of the interaction, being led to the front desk as he was asked about insurance information while I returned to the car with Abigail. I had had enough of the day, enough of the fluorescent blaring lights of the hospital, and of people and their judgmental gazes. I crossed the silent parking lot, passing an older man in a wheelchair taking a smoke outside, the click of my shoes on the pavement echoing through the night. I'm not certain at what point I became aware of that sensation, that stomach turning, creeping feeling like a skeletal hand along the back of my neck that told me I was being watched. At some point, I slowed down, heart thudding heavily against my chest, ears straining, as I listened to the footsteps I'd slowly grown aware of. My stomach sank as they slowed in turn. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, paired with the stress of the day rendering my nerves shot, leaving my mind unable to think clearly. But in that moment, with Abigail in hand, all I could think to do was speed up. The area of the parking lot I'd entered was empty as far as I could tell, save for myself, my daughter, and whoever was behind me. And the realization filled me with a cold, heavy dread. My pace quickened until I was practically speed walking. All the while, I could hear the echoes of footsteps following not too distantly in between my own. Realization struck like a blade in the dark. They're following me. Somebody is following me. I broke into a run. To my horror, the person behind me soon followed suit. I wanted to scream, to shriek out for help, and yet in the moment I felt robbed of words. Panic flooded my every mental pathway as I could think only of one thing: get Abigail to safety.